I'm going to talk about vernal pools. I love vernal pools. Have you seen them? They're beautiful. They're these clay pans that hold water that falls in rainfall, and they hold water late into the late spring. Wow, look at that. And they're often accompanied by these mounds, unexplained mounds, either giant prehistoric gophers or frost heaving or some other processes created these mounds. NEMA mounds, and you see them down in the Central Valley. I think this is in Merced, and 3B is a little film about managing the vernal pools of UC Merced. Would have helped if they hadn't built it on them, but they are surrounded by vast areas of vernal pools, quite beautiful. So in these clay pans, where the pan is hard, now the problem is with these is they're getting rare. If this is for farming, they just rip down through that soil and destroy the clay pan, and then you don't have these pools anymore. This is not great for farming. And boy, you see that happening if you go up 99 into Butte and into those counties. It's sad. But where they're protected, you have this clay pan, or where the land is just used for grazing, you have these clay pans. The water sits in there, and that water gets really ugly through the spring, right? It's evaporating constantly. It's like a mini salt flat. It's pretty high and dissolves stuff, including salt. Many of the organisms can't take the heat. They dry, they die. That further pollutes this water. It's a harsh environment. It can also get very hot, too hot for the many plants and animals. And then, of course, it can dry up. And we're talking about abiotic factors. Some years there's a lot of rain and they last for months. Some years there's hardly any and they may not even form. So whatever lives in them has to deal with that some years there might not be a pool, and some years the pool will dry up in a week. You have to be tremendously adaptable. Not to mention drinking pretty bad water or swimming in it. So each vernal pool in California has its own endemic vegetation that only exists in California, and they're often these really nice, lovely little flowers. Okay. Very nice. And as the pool dries, they make rings of flowers. It's really beautiful and lovely. And inside the pools, living there, are some endangered species. Believe it or not, they're endangered because we hardly have any vernal pools left compared to what was here before. And those include some tadpole shrimp, and they include some tiger salamanders, California tiger salamander, another endangered species that has to lay its eggs in these pools. Then those eggs have to hatch, go through a larval stage, then crawl out of the pool. And they live outside of the pool for most of the year by digging into the ground and finding cool places to hang out until fall when the rain comes and they get back in there. They like gopher holes, snake holes, all kinds of holes in the grassland to hang out in. Sometimes they can migrate up to a mile to get to another pool, and they have to do that. They have to have that talent in order to spread genes around, right? There are frogs that simply dig into the mud and stay there through the dry season. It's a pretty amazing system, vernal pools. So if we're a conservationist and we see the delicate flowers and the beautiful pool, we don't want cows stepping in that, right? They're going to step in there. They're going to disturb this mud. They're going to eat these plants. What a terrible idea. Terrible. There's just some more lovely pictures. So it's a little, you can see different kinds of vegetation. Vernal pools, and this shows you how a clay pan, a clay layer, prevents the water from soaking into the ground right here, so that when there's a dip into the water table, you get a vernal pool. But through the summer, this is going to evaporate. And here's your mounds. So you need a perched water table above a hard pan layer to make a vernal pool. Here's some of the animals that live in a vernal pool. Tadpole shrimp, fairy shrimp. These things lay eggs and then die. and then the eggs hatch the next time it rains. So they get through this incredible stressful environment by dying, just like wild oats. That's their plan for the summer. And yeah, make cysts and stuff like that. Here's the eggs. I think it's tiger salamander eggs that hatch in the vernal pool once it gets wet. And then the animals have to go through their larval stage. And here's the California tiger salamander. Here's the larval stage, these tadpoles. Interesting, huh? And then this guy, who's super beautiful, comes out once he's mature and crawls around in the grass. What do you think? Do you think that short grass or tall grass will be easier for him to walk through? Because their legs are pretty stubby. Now, when you have unrestricted annual grassland growth, they practically make the vernal pools disappear. And there's a couple mechanisms. One, they're taller than the native grasses and native flowers. So they tend to occupy the spaces that those flowers out and plants would have inhabited because they're taller, so they can shade out the light. They are competing there within a year. There is this competitive interaction near a vernal pool, and they just are much more dominant. So you can hardly see. This is an area like the one that you'll see in Part 3B in Merced County, Flying M Ranch. You'll see they're very hard to find when the grasses grow in an unrestricted way. When the grasses are grazed, this is the Hearst Ranch, then you start to see the plants that lived in the vernal pool and that formed around its edges. Here's after the water has evaporated. And yes, there's stomple marks, but yes, there's also these endemic species, and they're doing well. In fact, there was a study done by Jamie Marty and Dave Pike in 2005, where they looked at different grazing treatments on vernal pools. And here is a change in native species richness versus degree of grazing. Do you graze all the time, which means through the season when there's green grass? Do you graze, well, only in the dry season? Do you graze not at all? Do you graze only in the wet season? Continuous can mean all year or all season. I don't know which one they did here, but since they've got dry season, they probably grazed all year. So when we look at the edge of the pool, what's the tallest? Green. Oh, continuous grazing all the time. Now, why would that be? Based on your huge knowledge of selectivity, you saw that big fat cow who had access to all the plants she wanted and could pick and choose. Well, generally, the longer the cattle are in there versus the amount of forage, the more they can pick and choose. To have continuous grazing, you've got to have not so many cows and a lot of forage. So in that environment, they can graze the stuff they like the best, and they're not forced to graze the small flowers that grow around the pools. They're going to go for what they like, which is the grass. The dry season grazing when it's relatively dry also seems to be very beneficial. With no grazing, species richness declines a lot for the reasons I've already described. And with the wet season, it declines also. So these two are different. Grazing during the dry season or continuous grazing versus grazing, no grazing or grazing only during the wet season. Because it really works best, I think, if the cattle have access to the grass for a long period of time so they can continue to select and continue to remove it as the pools dry out and these flowers grow and start to die. And if they have enough selection, they will pick the grasses. They like them better. So the other way that the annual grasses affect the pools, which I didn't mention, is that the annual grasses drink a lot of water, and they will shorten the amount of time, the inundation time, that the pools are wet. So that's another impact they have. If we go here to the pool itself, there's actually no significant difference, just like there's no significant difference between these two or these two. Seems like wet season maybe better, but it's not statistically significant, so we really can't see that. And then upland, away from the pools and the dry grassland, species richness is still improved over no grazing because of the removal of a lot of that biomass. I hope you looked at the articles. I posted the link to this article that was done by a bunch of our alums that shows the influence of grazing removal of biomass for fire hazard reduction. Pretty neat study. I put it in the announcements. So I like to think of a within season year selection gradient that we can use when we're doing management of grazing that we can consider. If we use a light grazing pressure, as we usually do when we have continuous grazing, there's the greatest opportunity for animals to select one plant over another. Now, if you're in the prairies of the Midwest and you're worried about competition and how it's going to affect plants as they grow year after year, you don't want selection. You want them to graze everything pretty much the same so that the plants will grow the same. But with a light grazing pressure, you're not going to get that. So a lot of management for competition or to reduce that effect of selection involves putting the animals in one place pretty crowded and then moving them on. So they get more of a lawnmower type of pattern of grazing. Here in the vernal pools, oh, we're going to go for this. We're going to go for a relatively light grazing pressure. And that would be a herd roaming a large pasture, which is the scenario with continuous grazing. So in any of these, you may, a herd roaming a large pasture. And we can use that for vernal pools. And I did my dissertation on managing grazing for weed control in plantations where they're trying to grow trees as an alternative to herbicides, which foresters were big on at the time in the 80s. And if you gave them a lot of choice, the animals would not eat pine trees. They don't like them. Or oak trees. They'd just eat the brush and grass that was competing with the pine trees and the oaks, regrowing trees after harvest. And that enabled the regrowing trees to grow faster because they didn't have to compete with these weeds, as they call them, weeds. Intermediate, now that's an interesting case. The deer come through that area where I did my study in the forest, but the deer will eat everything. They bit the trees off and they ate the vegetation, but there weren't very many of them. There are not nearly as many of them per square foot as a grazed area. So their impacts were relatively light, but you couldn't do the same effect with deer and you couldn't do it with goats because goats like to eat trees very much. But cattle don't like to eat trees. So what an animal likes and its selection, all I'm trying to say, varies. So you need to know. Intermediate levels of grazing, they have a kind of intermediate ability to select their food. Sometimes if they don't, if toward the end of the season, there may not be very much left. They're not going to have as much choice. But this is the typical California conservative stocking rate that I mentioned, where you put animals on a little less than you could if you were going to try to put the maximum, because you know that the rainfall may or may not be average. So you stock for below average rainfall, and then you have more flexibility depending on the rainfall. Now, if we're seriously going to use grazing for fire control, that's not ideal. We want them to take the biomass, so we'll have to figure out a way to handle that. Sometimes ranchers, they leave grass behind. They go someplace else in the summer, maybe up to the mountains, and they leave a lot of untouched grass behind to come back to. They talk about coming back to in the fall to a lot of dry vegetation, because right now there's hardly anything for anybody to eat out there. But I know someone who did that, and I think I talked about this already. It exploded during the fires. He created a great place for fire. So we need to work on that too. But anyway, this intermediate, that's what works at Coyote Ridge. You've got some butterfly, habitat, pollinators, a diversity of habitat and species may be the best thing for pollinators, for raptors, because yes, no grazing and light grazing produces more rodents, but harder for the raptors to hunt. So maybe an intermediate effect, which is more patchy, would be better. See, this is fun. It's like cooking. And then if you graze heavy, they don't have much choice. If you compact a few into a small area, that helps prevent any effects on one plant being grazed more than another. So small pastures with lots of cows or goats or sheep or whatever. Burrowing owls really like short grass. Kit fox really likes short grass. For weed control, you can put them in a pasture specifically on where there's a lot of weedy species and get them hungry enough to eat them. So that's 1 year. That's what you can do within a year. Can it carry over to future years? Well, we talked about RDM can affect what seeds germinate and how they grow for a while in the rainy season, but how much it rains is going to be more important, really. We don't know sometimes why things happen in the California grassland. There's so many different factors affecting the grass and grazing and how grazing affects the grass. We're not really sure, especially with native grasses. They would have a carryover effect, but what happens is hard to predict. Well, my friend who's worked in the grasslands all his life and is a great ecologist says, well, what happens the next year really, it's about 60% of that is about how much rain falls and the temperatures in the winter. That's the main driver. That's your classic non-equilibrium model driver. We can't control it. And some environmental factors. 5%, some would say 10, is due to our management. That's not very much, right? What happens the next year? Not very much. If you exclude erosion, not very much, not very predictable unless you've got a lot of perennial grasses, which you probably won't. But, and then 35% of what happens in the following year might be unknown because of things like this. We don't know what's causing that change. And the grassland is exciting in California because it does change every year. It is possible to manage it within year pretty easily with herbivory or fire, but very hard to create change that lasts over years just based on how you graze a plant or how much material you remove, because the plants largely come from seed every year. Now, I'm not saying you can't have a carryover effect on brush. We're talking about annual grass. In other words, if you have a shrub and you graze it practically dead, it's going to take years for that to grow back, hopefully. And it will change the shape of the shrub. You see that with places with a lot of deer grazing or livestock grazing. Goats can create that effect. They can have anything that'll eat a shrub. And I studied cattle that were shrub-eating cattle. That will have a longer-term effect. And in fact, people use grazing to manipulate shrubs and trees. This is from Spain, using livestock to create a tree out of a shrub. Kind of interesting. They have a big art to managing oaks. This is in California. This is a faithful goat. Remember, we walked right by this oak. It's quite large now, but here's a goat removing oak sprouts and clearing that out. Remember, we saw those big spreads of oak trying to escape herbivory. And they also eat poison oak. They eat all kinds of back plants. They don't particularly care for baccharis or broom, but they can be forced to eat it by crowding them onto it. They are good for brush. Goats like brush. They have some adaptations in their digestive system that makes it possible for them to eat shrubs that have a lot of volatile compounds, meaning they smell really strongly. I never succeeded in getting a goat to eat rosemary though, but they'll eat a lot of things. So they're considered the best for manipulating brush. I think that goats are like the pruning shears of the grazing world, domestic animal world. Cows are the vacuum cleaners, and sheep, I'm not sure. They eat a lot of the broadleaves, I'm not sure, but they're very useful animals and also can be used to remove grass biomass. And they are more likely to eat shrubs. They're somewhere in between. So here's a picture, a film of vegetation management. I'll post this separately because I understand they're difficult when you're looking at this movie. You may recognize this location. This is up at the Livermore, or at the lab, LBL, Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And there is a goat herder. We'll see him come down. I love that they have these guys managing traffic for these goats. But they're being used to protect us from another one of those fires like we had. Let's see, let's watch. What's making these goats go in this direction? How are they being controlled? Oh, there's a dog. There's the sheep herder following them down across the street. He's going to tell them where to put the goats. That's great. I could watch that a lot. Oh, I'm supposed to be moving on. Fire is another way. Fire will take out woody vegetation and grass. And of course, the fire's effect on woody vegetation lasts a lot longer. Fire doesn't really have that many carryover effects on grass either, but it really is good on woody vegetation. Unfortunately, in a lot of our forests, there's just so much woody vegetation, and they're near trees that the fire can be carried into. It makes burning really hard, and once vegetation is really woody, goats aren't going to do it either. So we've got some problems out there. We're going to have to address some of them with chainsaws. Oh, I took this picture off the interstate just to show that grazing, this is cattle grazing over here, can definitely change the amount of woody vegetation. And one thing about putting grazing and fire together, you could remove a lot of this vegetation with fire, with prescribed burning, and then the cattle will keep it gone. Because almost all those domestic animals love fresh resprouts after a fire. And when the shrubs are small, they don't have very many secondary volatile compounds. And so grazing animals, not just domestic ones, deer and elk and everybody else, loves a good fire. And here we have a lot of RDM that is not going to be removed anytime soon. Okay. And you know, this side, once it gets dry, it can burn. But it's going to be easier to put that fire out. If you watch some of the fires that they were fighting last year, whenever the fires got into a grassland, everybody just stood around and relaxed and let it burn through, because unless there's a high wind, it's just going to slowly creep through the grassland. Now wind is a problem. And here's, I think this is a Briones. This is Baccharis, which has grown so crazily in Strawberry Canyon. And this has just always been grazed, and the Baccharis has never been able to spread into this grassland. It's a native species, but it spreads, and it is a fire hazard. So while cattle would not eat this, they'll eat it when it's little and keep it from spreading. And East Bay Regional Parks uses it that way. So this is a little just to illustrate that changes in how often you burn and how hot the fire is will affect grasslands. And burning often results in less fire, lower intensity fires, because there's not that much fuel. When you have a rare fire every 100 years, you get a really big fire in the forest. Not so much in the grassland, it's just grass. But shrubs, yes, very big fire. And this fire's being a little selective. It picked this little spot. I don't think that's the name that a real fire scientist would use, but since we're talking about selectivity, it's interesting. There's no animal brain behind fire's selectivity. And you can use it for native grass enhancement, possibly, sometimes, and it can be used for weed control sometimes. A lot of times you'd have to burn a lot often. For example, if you have yellow star thistle and you burn it 3 times, 3 years in a row, you will reduce the seeds of yellow star thistle. They're big seeds. They tend to be on top of the soil for a long period of time. So you can reduce those. Unfortunately, 30 years after you stop burning, it tends to come back. To find a better solution, another solution is to graze yellow star thistle when it's really small and doesn't have thistly thorns on it, goats are really good for that. And that'll keep it from expressing itself within a year. Not so sure about the next year. Or a 1-year management thing. It's good because then you don't have to live forever to study change. It happens every year. It's just too much, too many different factors affecting it. So we teased out a few. Prescribed fire for biodiversity. Okay, so it can change woody vegetation structure away from woody plants, which might displace other plants and which shade other plants. The idea isn't to get rid of it all, of course, but to create more openings for more diversity. Woodlands with shade plus sun, tremendously diverse plants. It can increase pollinator-friendly plants. Fire can too. It can increase diversity depending, everything depends. It can increase the nutrient value of vegetation, and that's easy. It removes fiber. The fresh resprouts don't have that fiber, so they're easier to digest. And the fresh green means high in protein, relatively, for a plant, for a grass or a shrub, and vitamins. You know, that's why we eat green things. We don't put a bunch of dead stems on our plates and eat them. The nutrients are much higher in the grass. You know, interestingly enough, some animals, their reproduction is timed by when vegetation gets green by some of the vitamins. I think vitamin A in particular can stimulate reproduction. So when the vegetation starts growing and the animals start eating that, then the body knows it's time to reproduce because there's likely to be food. And removal of fuels, meaning dead plants or any plants, can reduce the fire hazard, and you can do that with fire. You can reduce fire with more fire. I think we're seeing so many articles about that right now, and very few about grazing. I'm enraged. Not really. Long-term vegetation to reintroduction and repeated use of fire. So using fire in the forest. Scott Stevens in our department does a lot of this kind of work. It's pretty cool. So we're just not going to look at all of these. You can peruse them at your choice. But let's see. A is you look at what's the effect on the diversity of all species. I think this is number of species. So this is unburned forest. This is forest that was burned once. And you can see that diversity is quite a bit higher. The number of species is quite a bit higher, to illustrate what I said about woody vegetation suppressing some species. And if you burn it twice, they only got this far in the burning. I think and it comes up to here. It's still higher than unburned of all species. Graminoids, that would be grass. You can see a real difference in the grass after 2 burns. It's quite a bit higher than 1 burn and quite a bit higher than no burn. What's D? D is pretty complicated. D is perennial forbs, weeds. 2 burns, well, I don't mean to say weeds, flowers. With 2 burns, it declined a little bit. I don't know why, but with 1, quite a bit higher. And then here, E, what's E? Shrubs. With shrubs, got many more species with 2 and 1 burn than you do in an unburned forest. And many more species of trees, interestingly enough, especially with 2 burns. Probably get more oaks, among other things. Here's that famous checker spot butterfly. We've already talked about this, but fire benefits them the same way grazing does, by removing biomass and allowing these forbs that they pollinate and to grow. After a fire, you may see quite a bit of vegetation. This is fireweed that grows after a fire, and you only see it after a fire. So there's an aspect of biodiversity enhancement over time with fire. These will go away as the other vegetation grows back, but isn't that beautiful? A few dead trees, but it's really pretty. So there are whole suites of species, fire following, they call them. Quite spectacular that fire can bring back into the landscape. And this is an illustration. This is a burrowing owl. What a cute critter. Totally eaten by feral cats. Likes to see because it has to be safe. So there are not very many in town because of the feral cat issue. There's a couple preserves around. A friend tells me one's right near the Google campus, and the Google campus has like really complicated, amusing feral cat feeders that people like to watch near it, and they're wiping out the owls at the preserve, and she's been talking to them. She's a cooperative extension advisor, been talking to them about maybe not feeding the cats. Anyway, these are all species that like relatively bare soil. These are the burrowing owls. They are the cutest little guys. There were even some in my backyard when I first moved here. I haven't seen one in eons. Kangaroo rat. There's a really great study of kangaroo rats showing that grazing definitely benefits them. But this guy had trouble getting the local ranchers to graze enough because they said, no, I'm not going to graze down that far. My animals will lose weight. And that's what I mean about the trade-offs between what we want to use the animals for and the ranchers need to make income from the cattle. We're going to have to pay people. That's what we do with goats, as much as $1,000 an acre to get goats to graze. And they are not going to be using the goats for production, only for fire control. So they don't have that trade-off, but it's a costly situation not to have that trade-off. They also need to be watched because dogs and coyotes and everything eats sheep and goats. They like them. So kit fox, they try to keep the vegetation relatively short in kit fox territory. Aren't they the cutest things? We have those in eastern Contra Costa County. You know, in habitat conservation plans, they tend to leave corridors for the kit fox. That's one step. The second step is to manage the vegetation for them. And what do? We use fire. People talk about burn plans and how we use burn plans. A burn prescription, because you need to consider all kinds of things before you set a fire. Fire can be dangerous. So how do you make it safe? And how do you manage fire to get the things that you want, the goals that you want? You can burn for all kinds of different goals. But so your plan includes what you're hoping to achieve with the natural resources in the site, how you're going to set the fire, how many places, uphill, downhill, what weather. So they always give weather parameters that tell them the relative humidity has to be above a certain amount. The fuels have to have achieved a certain level of dryness. So they go and look at the woody vegetation, the woody waste, the dry things in a forest or in a grassland, and see, because it takes bigger things much longer time to dry out than smaller things. So we need to consider that. And whether it's going to rain or not, how dry it is, all those things have to be considered. Whether there's going to be wind. Wind is a big enemy of prescribed burning. The topography, fires like to burn uphill. Got to consider that too. Smoke management. We have to meet air quality requirements. So we have to keep track of how much, is it a burn day? You know, we have these spare the air days. You can't do a prescribed burn on a spare the air day. And there's increasing conflict that way because we have more and more population. They're creating a lot of pollution. Adding smoke from fires to it is not looked upon not looked upon well, and I'm not sure that I want to sacrifice my air quality. I've had enough, right? Okay, you need to tell the public it's going to happen. There are people who have a lot of reactions to smoke, and they need to know it's going to happen so they can take steps to protect themselves. Many people are perfectly willing to do that. You need the special equipment for being around a fire, unflammable clothes, Calavar cloth. You need fire engines nearby or some sort of firefighting resources nearby. And you need to know, yes, what are the plants, the animals, how are they going to react? And is it a steep uphill burn? Has a big chance of getting pretty hot? Or is it, they like to do them downhill because they don't burn so much. So fiercely, you can control it better. But All those things have to go into a burn plan. And here's a guy with a drip torch setting a prescribed fire. This is like a little bit like napalm, and you just lay it down and set a fire. You can use this to manipulate the vegetation or to hopefully clear the ground before a wildfire gets there and prevent the wildfire. So that's called a backfire. So these guys are doing prescribed burning. I've got to tell you, this is fun, major fun. Something about people. We like to set fires. Boy, we did some burning in the forest when I was a student. And one of the things you have to do after timber harvest is you have a pile of small logs and brush and waste material, and you make them into a pile and then you set them on fire. And we would go hang out by the fire with marshmallows, and it's pretty fun. And you don't do them till it's cooled down in the fall, maybe even a little snow on the ground. So burn plan for prescribed fire seeks to control how hot the fire is, its intensity, how severe, how much it's going to burn, how much organic matter is it going to burn. So fire severity, you would go out to a place that's been burned, and if even the biggest trees have been turned into ash, that's a pretty severe fire. Ecosystem responses, we do research on that. We want to have some vegetation consumed and some left. We seek to control that. Whether we want an even burn, this is just like grazing, or a patchy burn, or a mosaic of vegetation, and what time of year. You don't want to set bushes on fire when birds are making nests in them, things like that. You need to consider that. Grazing is a little easier in that sense. We do tend to keep cows out of areas when there's some reproductive stuff going on, but it's fairly benign in most cases. And we don't want escapes. Fires escape. We've had some notable escapes in California. Cows escape too, and they always put them on the news as they wander through suburban neighborhoods. But they tend to leave the neighborhood behind. Oh, take out a piece of paper. I don't care how big. We're going to do a quiz. You don't have to turn it in. I'm telling you that right now. Take it for fun. Please rank the following drivers in order of their impact on the production of grass in California annual rangelands around the Bay Area. So do that. So know which of these factors are abiotic. Which ones? Think about it. This is a good thing that I would put on a test. Would an equilibrium or non-equilibrium model fit this system the best? What do you think in California grasslands? We're going to be looking at a lot of grasslands. What about this one? This is like a worksheet. It's for you to study. Figure it out.